The first time I met Linda, I knew exactly what she thought of me. It wasn't in the polite smile she forced when she opened the door or the way she gestured me inside without a word. It was in the flicker of disdain that crossed her face as she looked me up and down, assessing and dismissing me all in one breath. The flat was small but clean, with white walls and cold, sterile light. I'd only been in the city a few weeks, still finding my footing after leaving the home I'd shared with my late husband for over 30 years. I'd come to be closer to my son Min, hoping that in this bustling city I could find a new beginning. Linda owned the building, and I was just one more tenant in her eyes. "Here's the kitchen," she said, her voice clipped and disinterested. "And the living room. You'll need to keep the noise down, some of us work long hours." I nodded, biting back the words that rose in my throat. I'd always been careful, always mindful of my place. But there was something in the way she said it that stung as if she already saw me as a nuisance. We stood in the small living room, the window looking out onto the street below. Linda folded her arms and leaned against the doorframe, her eyes scanning the boxes I'd stacked in the corner. "You're moving in alone?" she asked, her tone as casual as a flick of dust. "Yes," I said softly. "My husband passed away last year. My son lives nearby." Linda's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, that's something, I suppose," she said. "But let's be clear, you don't really belong here. This is a young neighborhood, busy people, lots of movement. It's not really a place for someone like you." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. I felt them lodge deep in my chest, a quiet ache that was all too familiar. I'd heard them in different forms all my life, softly spoken or shouted outright. "You don't belong here. You're in the way. You're not enough." I pressed my lips together and forced a smile. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. Or rather, I refused to. Linda didn't seem to notice the tightness in my voice. She turned away, already bored of me. "Rent's due on the 1st of the month," she said over her shoulder. "Don't be late." As she left, I stood in the middle of the room, the hum of the city outside the only sound. My fingers traced the worn edges of the small table I'd brought with me, the last piece of furniture my husband had built before he died. I could still see his hands in every groove of the wood, the patience and care he'd poured into it. It was a reminder of everything I'd survived and everything I still carried. I sank down onto the chair, the weight of Linda's words settling over me like dust. "You don't belong here." I let them echo for a moment, let them fill the silence. But then I took a deep breath and let them go. Because I knew better. I had built a life from nothing once before. I had stood beside my husband as we scraped together every penny to buy our first home, had raised a son, and watched him grow into a man. I had weathered storms and losses and the quiet heartbreaks that come with loving and losing. I had belonged everywhere I'd ever chosen to be, not because someone else said I could, but because I'd made it so, and I would do it again. I unpacked my few belongings slowly that afternoon, filling the small flat with pieces of my past, a chipped teacup from my mother, the faded quilt I'd sewn the year Min was born, the small, careful stack of letters my husband had written me when we were first married. Each item was a piece of me, a quiet declaration that I wasn't going anywhere. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the city beyond the window, the distant rumble of cars, the laughter of people spilling out of restaurants and bars. It was a new world, loud and unfamiliar, but it was mine now. Linda's words were just that, words. They had no power over me unless I let them. I closed my eyes and pictured the garden I'd tended for years in my old home, the roses that had bloomed even in the coldest winters. I thought of the way they'd stubbornly pushed through the frost, bright and alive. I would be like them, rooted, resilient, and impossible to ignore. Linda might think I didn't belong here, but she would learn soon enough that I was here to stay. The days that followed were a quiet sort of blur. I settled into the small flat, learning the rhythms of the building and the city beyond. Each morning, I watched the commuters rush past the window, their faces set in determination or lost in thought. In the evenings, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows on the pavement. I spent my time making the flat feel like home, I unpacked the last of my boxes, arranging the teacups, and framed photographs with care. My husband's picture found a place of honor on the small table by the window, his gentle smile a constant reminder of the life we'd shared. I dusted the old bookshelf and filled it with the novels and cookbooks I'd brought with me, familiar titles that brought comfort and a sense of normalcy. Every so often, I'd catch sight of Linda in the corridor. She'd walk past with her head held high, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She never spoke more than a brisk greeting, but the dismissiveness in her gaze spoke volumes. To her, I was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, a tenant who would eventually pack up and leave. But I had no intention of leaving. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, I would sit with a cup of tea and let my thoughts wander. I thought of the small house I'd left behind the rose bushes in the garden, the creak of the stairs that had carried my footsteps for decades. I thought of my husband's laughter, the way he'd held my hand when the world felt too heavy. I missed him, of course. The ache of his absence was a constant companion. But even in the loneliness, I found a strange sort of peace. I'd carried so much of him with me, woven into the very fibers of my being. His strength, his quiet determination, they were mine now. One evening, Min came to visit. He stood in the doorway, his smile tired but warm. "How are you settling in, Mum?" he asked, stepping inside. I poured him a cup of tea, the familiar ritual soothing us both. "I'm managing," I said, my voice calm. "It's not the same, but it will do." He looked around the flat, taking in the small touches I'd added: the quilt, the photographs, the vase of flowers I'd placed on the windowsill. "It already feels like home," he said softly. "You've always been good at that." We sat together, the evening light casting a golden glow over the room. Min spoke of his work, the challenges of city life, and I listened, my heart swelling with quiet pride. He had grown into a man of integrity and kindness, qualities I'd hoped to nurture in him all those years ago. Before he left, he took my hand in his. "If you ever need anything, Mum, anything at all, you only have to ask." "I know," I said, squeezing his fingers gently. "But I'll be all right." After he was gone, I sat in the silence and let the warmth of his visit linger. It gave me strength, reminded me of why I'd come here in the first place. I hadn't moved to this city just to survive. I'd come to build something new, to carve out a place for myself, even if others thought I didn't belong. I began to notice the small details of the building as the days turned to weeks. The way the front door stuck in the winter, damp, the rattle of the pipes when the radiators kicked in. I noticed the older residents who nodded politely in the corridor, and the young families who hurried by with prams and shopping bags. There was a quiet community here, one I wanted to be a part of, even if Linda thought otherwise. One morning, as I watered the small potted plant by the window, I overheard Linda on the phone. Her voice was low, but the irritation in her tone was unmistakable. "She's still there," she said, pausing to listen. "Yes, I know. I told her she didn't belong here. I don't know why she won't just go." I felt a flicker of something deep inside me. Not anger exactly, but a steady growing resolve. I'd heard enough in my life to recognize that tone, the casual cruelty of someone who thought they held all the cards. Linda might think she could dismiss me with a few careless words. But she didn't know me. She didn't know the years I'd spent fighting for my family, for my home, for the small, quiet joys that made life worth living. As I poured the last of the water into the soil, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let her decide where I belonged. I had roots here now, and I would nurture them until they were too deep to tear out. Linda could look past me all she liked. She could pretend I didn't matter. But I was here, and I wasn't going anywhere. The chill of winter had begun to settle into the city by the time I found the library. It was a small red brick building tucked between a row of shops, its warm light spilling out onto the cold pavement. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the scent of old paper and dust instantly comforting. I'd come here on a quiet mission of my own, one that I had not told even Min about. The library had always been my refuge, a place to learn and think. It was also where I hoped to find the answers to the questions that had been taking root in my mind. Linda's words still echoed in my ears, her calm certainty that I didn't belong. But I knew now that she had more than just her pride tied to this building. There were papers to read, records to uncover, and I was determined to know everything about the place I called home. The librarian, a kind woman named Margaret, greeted me with a soft smile. Looking for something in particular, she asked as I pulled off my gloves. I'm hoping to find information about property ownership, I said carefully. Specifically this building. She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Ah, well, let me show you to the local archives. We've some old records that might help. I followed her down a narrow aisle lined with shelves of worn books. She left me in a small alcove, the glow of a single reading lamp falling across the dusty volumes. I settled into the hard wooden chair and began to read. At first, it was just names and dates, faded signatures, the echo of lives long past. But as I sifted through the papers, a story began to emerge. The building had once been a grand house owned by a family whose name was still etched faintly into the lintel above the main door. Over the years, it had changed hands many times, some owners caring and diligent others who saw only profit. I traced the lines of ownership with my finger, noting each sale, each mortgage. My mind worked carefully, piecing together the fragments like a puzzle. And in those pages, I found something else, a note about a pending sale, a whisper of change that Linda hadn't mentioned. The current owner, an elderly man, who lived in another city, had been looking to sell. I felt my heart quicken at the possibility. Could it be true? Could this building my home be within my reach? I sat back in the chair, the faint smell of old paper filling my senses. It was a wild thought, and yet it felt right. My husband had always said that opportunity often hid in the quiet corners of life, waiting for someone brave enough to seek it out. Maybe this was mine. I copied down the details carefully, each name and date written in my neatest hand. When I finished, I closed the dusty book with a soft thud and slipped my notebook into my bag. As I left the library, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me, stronger than the cold wind that swept down the street. At home, I laid out my notes on the kitchen table, the lamplight turning the paper a warm gold. My small flat felt less like a temporary refuge and more like the beginning of something new. I ran my fingers over the names, the weight of them grounding me. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Linda would never believe I had it in me to do more than pay the rent on time. But she didn't know the years I'd spent managing a household on scraps, and Hope didn't know the quiet strength that came from loving and losing, and starting over again. I made a list that night, just as I had all those years ago, when my husband and I first scraped together enough to buy our home. Find a solicitor. Speak to the bank. Learn every inch of this building's history until I knew it better than anyone. The next morning, I began my quiet preparations. I walked to the solicitor's office, my breath a mist in the cold air. Inside, the young man behind the desk looked surprised when I asked to speak to someone about purchasing a building. "Of course, Mrs. Tran," he said after a moment's pause. "Let me see who's available to help you." I waited patiently, my hands folded in my lap, and when the solicitor came, I greeted him with a calm smile. I spoke clearly and firmly, telling him what I wanted and why. He listened, nodding slowly as I laid out the facts. "It's not impossible," he said finally. "It will take time and patience, but if you're determined, we can make it happen." I thanked him and left the office with my head held high. Outside, the city bustled around me, indifferent to the small, determined woman moving through its streets. But I knew what I was doing. Each step I took was another quiet assertion of my right to belong. Linda might think she could dismiss me. She might think she could tell me where I did or did not belong. But she was wrong. I was just getting started. The days that followed were a flurry of small, deliberate steps. Each morning, I rose early, the winter light pale and cold through the curtains, and dressed as though I were going to meet the world head-on. I knew that nothing worth having came quickly, and so I moved with quiet purpose. I visited the bank, speaking with a patient young woman named Chloe, who explained my options with surprising gentleness. I could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes when I told her what I wanted to do. But she didn't question me, and for that I was grateful. "You're certain?" she asked as she set down her pen. "I'm certain," I said, my voice unwavering. "This isn't just a building to me, it's my home." Chloe nodded her lips, curving into a small smile. "Then let's see what we can make possible," she said. At night, I would sit at the small kitchen table, papers spread out around me like a map of quiet dreams. I read each line carefully, tracing every word with a fingertip until I knew it by heart. I wasn't naive, I knew the risks. But there was something exhilarating in the thought of taking control, of proving to myself that I could do more than simply endure. Meanwhile, Linda swept through the building with her usual air of careless superiority. She still gave me that same look whenever we crossed paths, a flick of her eyes, a small curl of her lips, as though she found my very presence inconvenient. But I no longer let her words or her glances settle in my bones. I let them wash over me like rain, cold and harmless. One evening, as I returned from the solicitor's office, I saw her standing outside the building, her phone pressed to her ear. She was dressed impeccably, her coat cinched at the waist, her hair gleaming in the fading light. She caught sight of me and turned slightly, her words carrying on the crisp air. "Yes, I told her she doesn't belong here," she said, her voice light and dismissive. "She's just in the way." She didn't lower her voice, didn't even try to hide the words. For a moment, the old ache stirred in my chest, but it was fleeting. I knew now that her words were nothing but noise. I walked past her without a word, my head held high. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Inside my flat, I poured myself a cup of tea, the fragrant steam warming my hands. I looked out the window at the darkening sky, the city lights beginning to glow like stars. I thought of the path I was on, the quiet determination that had carried me this far. Linda's words couldn't shake that. They were just the final push I needed. The next day, I received a letter that changed everything. It was from the elderly man who still owned most of the building, the one whose name I'd found in the library records. His handwriting was neat and formal, the words carefully chosen. He was tired, he wrote. He was getting on in years and wanted to settle his affairs. If I was truly interested in the building, he would be willing to discuss the possibility of a sale. I read the letter 3 times, my heart pounding. It was the chance I'd been waiting for, the crack in the wall I needed to step through. I wrote back immediately, my hand steady as I penned the words. I told him of my respect for the building, of my quiet hopes to preserve its soul. I spoke not as a buyer, but as a caretaker, someone who would tend to the building as she had always tended to her family. When I posted the letter, I felt a thrill of hope rush through me. This was no longer just a dream, it was becoming real. And as the days passed waiting for his reply, I found that I no longer feared Linda's cutting words or her cold glances. They were meaningless now, just the last remnants of a fight she hadn't even realized she'd lost. I spent my evenings dreaming of what could be, how I would care for the building, how I would make it a home not just for myself, but for everyone who lived within its walls. A place of kindness, of respect, of quiet belonging. Linda had once told me I didn't belong here, but she didn't understand that home isn't just a place you rent or own, it's a place you nurture, a place you protect. And as I waited for the old man's reply, I knew that no matter how the final chapters of this story played out, I had already claimed something that no one could take away: my place, my voice, my quiet, unshakable resolve. The reply came on a cold, gray morning. The envelope was plain, but my heart beat faster as I held it in my hands. I opened it slowly, the paper crisp under my fingertips. Inside, the letter was brief but warm. The elderly man, Mr. Harris, thanked me for my kind words. He wrote of his fond memories of the building and his hope that it would continue to be a home for those who truly cared for it. He said he would be happy to meet with me to discuss the sale. I read his words again and again, my breath catching in my throat. This was it, the moment when everything changed. I rang Margaret, the solicitor I'd met weeks before, and arranged for her to join me at the meeting. She was calm and confident, as always, her precise questions and careful notes a comfort. I wore my best coat, the one my husband had bought me years ago, and pinned my hair back with the small silver clip he'd given me on our anniversary. I wanted to walk into that meeting as the woman I truly was, dignified, prepared, and unafraid. The meeting took place in a small cafe near the river, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the cold air. Mr. Harris was waiting when I arrived, a kindly man, with eyes that still held a twinkle of mischief. He rose when he saw me, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Mrs. Tran," he said, his voice gentle, "I'm so glad you came." We sat and talked for over an hour, Margaret by my side, as we discussed the details of the building's history, its quirks and charms, and the many people who had called it home over the years. Mr. Harris listened to my hopes for the building, the repairs I wanted to make, the sense of community I longed to nurture. When I spoke of the way Linda had dismissed me, his eyes grew sharp, and he shook his head. "People like her forget that these buildings have souls," he said quietly. "And so do the people who live in them." When we rose to leave, he took my hand in both of his. "I will be honored to sell the building to you, Mrs. Tran," he said. "I know you will care for it, as it deserves." Outside, the wind whipped around me cold and sharp, but I felt only warmth. I walked home, slowly, letting each step ground me in this new reality. I was no longer just a tenant. I was becoming something more, a protector, a caretaker, a woman reclaiming her own story. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table and let the weight of it all settle in. I thought of the years I had spent feeling small, of the countless times I had swallowed my words to keep the peace. I thought of Linda's smug smile, the way she had spoken to me like I was nothing. But I wasn't nothing. I had never been nothing. Over the next few weeks, the paperwork moved forward. Margaret guided me through it all with steady hands and clear explanations. I signed document after document, my signature bold and certain on each page. During that time, I kept to myself my plans a quiet secret. Linda continued to strut through the building, her dismissive words still slipping from her lips when she thought I wasn't listening. But I no longer felt the sting of them. Instead, I felt a quiet anticipation, a satisfaction that grew with each passing day. Finally, the day came when everything was complete. Margaret handed me the final papers, her eyes bright. "Congratulations, Mrs. Tran," she said softly. "It's yours." I held the papers in my hands, my heart swelling with a fierce pride. I thought of my husband and the small, steady life we had built together. I thought of Min, of the values I had tried to instill in him: patience, dignity, and the quiet courage to stand your ground. And I thought of Linda, who had told me I didn't belong here. The next morning, I called a meeting of the building's residents. Linda arrived last, her expression wary as she took a seat near the back. I stood before them, all the papers in my hand, and spoke clearly, my voice ringing through the room. "I am now the owner of this building," I said, my eyes meeting Linda's directly. "I want you all to know that I will care for this place, not just as a landlord, but as someone who believes that everyone has the right to feel at home." The room was silent for a moment, then a soft ripple of applause filled the space. Linda sat frozen, her face pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. I let the silence hang there for a moment, then turned to the others with a smile. "Let's work together," I said simply. "Let's make this a place we're all proud to call home." As I walked back to my flat, the sun broke through the clouds, its light spilling over the rooftops like a promise. I had claimed my place not just in this building, but in the world, and Linda would learn that some people cannot be pushed aside. The days after the meeting passed like a dream, each one a step deeper into the life I had reclaimed. There was so much to do, repairs to arrange, small fixes, and fresh paint to bring warmth and dignity back to these walls. I walked through the halls each morning, greeting my neighbors with a smile, listening to their worries and hopes. I was no longer just a tenant. I was the caretaker of something precious. Linda tried at first to act as though nothing had changed. She walked past me in the corridors with her usual air of superiority, chin lifted as if the world owed her something. But I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the way her smile no longer reached her lips. She had built her life on the belief that people like me could be dismissed with a word or a glance. Now she was forced to see me for who I truly was. A week after the meeting, she knocked on my door. I opened it to find her standing there, arms crossed over her chest, her eyes narrowed. "I suppose you think you've won," she said, her voice tight. I held her gaze calm and steady. "This was never about winning, Linda," I said quietly. "It was about standing my ground, about proving that everyone has a place even if others can't see it." She looked away, then her shoulders sagging. For the first time, I saw something like vulnerability in her expression, something almost like understanding. She didn't say another word, only nodded once and turned away. A week later, Linda signed her new lease with me. She sat across the table, her hands trembling slightly, as she wrote her name on the page. When she handed the pen back to me, I took it with steady hands, the weight of that moment pressing down on us both. I wasn't cruel. I didn't raise the rent or change the terms of her lease. I simply let her see that the world she thought she controlled was no longer hers alone. The building was mine now, and so was the quiet power I had found in myself. As the winter melted into spring, the building seemed to breathe easier. The pipes no longer rattled, the paint on the walls gleamed softly in the light. Even the old oak tree in the garden seemed to stand taller, its branches stretching towards the sky. One evening, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, Min came to visit. He looked around at the warm, welcoming flat, at the small touches I'd added to the halls and the garden outside. "You've done more than just buy a building, Mum," he said softly. "You've made it a home." I smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle in my chest like a quiet joy. "That's all I ever wanted," I said. I looked out at the street below, the lights of the city flickering in the dusk. I thought of the journey that had brought me here, of the words Linda had spoken, the doubt and fear that had once threatened to consume me. But I had faced it all, and I had come out stronger. I knew now that belonging isn't something that can be given or taken away by others. It's something you claim for yourself, something you build with each quiet act of courage and kindness. And as I watched the lights of the city sparkle, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Linda still lived in the building. She paid her rent on time, and we spoke only when necessary. But there was a new respect in her voice when she addressed me, a hesitant courtesy that had never been there before. She had learned, as I had, that sometimes the people you dismiss are the very ones who will rise above you. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of fresh paint and warm tea filling my senses. I had found my place here, not because someone had offered it to me, but because I had claimed it for myself. If you've ever been told you don't belong, let this story remind you, your worth isn't defined by someone else's words. Share this video if you believe that everyone has the right to stand their ground and find their place no matter what anyone says.